December 12, 1944. Nancy, France. Third Army headquarters buzzed with activity. Officers prepared for the next push into Germany. The war was almost won. Everyone knew it. Everyone except George S. Patton, Jr. The Third Army commander sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by his senior staff. Outside, snow was falling. Inside, Patton was about to say something that would make his officers uncomfortable. "The Germans are going to launch a major offensive," Patton announced. "And I think they're going to hit the Ardennes." The room fell silent. Staff officers exchanged glances. The Ardennes? That sleepy forest sector where exhausted divisions went to rest? The same quiet zone that SHAEF considered so safe they had stripped it of reserves? Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, spread maps across the table. He had been tracking German movements for weeks. The evidence was disturbing. German panzer divisions were disappearing from the line. Rail traffic behind German positions had increased dramatically. Radio silence had fallen over entire sectors. Something was building in the fog. Koch knew it. Patton believed it. But Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force didn't want to hear it. The war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, assessed that the Wehrmacht was incapable of mounting a significant offensive. His reports described a beaten army scraping together its last reserves for defensive operations. Patton looked at those reports with contempt. He trusted his own intelligence officer. He trusted his instincts. He had fought the Germans for 2 years. He knew they still had teeth. "I want 3 contingency plans," Patton told his staff. 1 for an attack to the north. 1 to the northeast. 1 to the east. When this thing hits, we're going to be ready to move in any direction within 48 hours. His officers began planning. They thought Patton was being paranoid. They had no idea he was being prophetic. 4 days later, 250,000 German soldiers attacked through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and George Patton was the only Allied general who wasn't surprised. The quiet sector. To understand why Patton's warning was dismissed, you have to understand what the Ardennes meant to Allied commanders in December 1944. The Ardennes was a heavily forested region spanning eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. It featured steep hills, narrow roads, and dense woodland that made armored operations extremely difficult. In 1940, the Germans had attacked through the Ardennes and surprised the French, but that was considered a one-time gamble that wouldn't work again. By December 1944, Allied generals viewed the Ardennes as a quiet sector. It was where you sent divisions that needed rest after heavy fighting. It was where you placed green units that needed time to acclimate before facing serious combat. It was the backwater of the Western Front. The 8th Corps held the Ardennes with 4 divisions spread across 80 miles of front. This was dangerously thin by any military standard. Normal defensive doctrine called for 1 division per 10 to 15 miles. The Ardennes had 1 division per 20 miles. But nobody worried. German intelligence reported minimal enemy activity. Aerial reconnaissance showed quiet roads. Signals intelligence detected nothing alarming. The Ardennes was safe. Major General Troy Middleton commanded 8 Corps from his headquarters in Bastogne. He had expressed concerns about his thin lines to his superiors. He was told not to worry. The Germans were finished. They couldn't attack anywhere, least of all through the impossible terrain of the Ardennes. This assessment came from the highest levels of Allied intelligence. Major General Kenneth Strong at SHAEF compiled weekly estimates of German capabilities. His December reports painted a picture of a Wehrmacht in terminal decline. German divisions were under strength. Fuel was critically short. The Luftwaffe was nearly destroyed. Hitler was scraping the bottom of the barrel. Strong's assessment wasn't unreasonable. Germany had suffered catastrophic losses since June. The Wehrmacht had lost over 1 million men on the Western Front alone. The Soviets were pushing toward Berlin. Germany's industrial capacity was being bombed around the clock. From SHAEF's perspective, any German offensive was simply impossible. They lacked the men, the tanks, the fuel, and the air cover to mount a serious attack. The war would be over by Christmas. Colonel Oscar Koch saw something different. the intelligence officer. Oscar Koch was not a typical intelligence officer. He was aggressive, persistent, and deeply skeptical of conventional wisdom. He had served with Patton since North Africa. He understood that his commander wanted intelligence that was accurate, not comfortable. Koch's job was to know the enemy. He spent his days studying German order of battle, analyzing intercepted communications, and tracking the movement of enemy units. He had developed a sixth sense for German intentions that went beyond mere data analysis. In late November 1944, Koch began noticing anomalies. German divisions were being pulled out of the line and moved to unknown locations. Rail traffic behind German positions was increasing despite Allied air superiority. German radio discipline had improved dramatically in certain sectors. Most concerning was the disappearance of the 6th Panzer Army. This was Germany's most powerful armored formation, rebuilt with new tanks and experienced crews. It had been positioned behind the Western Front for weeks. Now it had vanished from Allied intelligence tracking. Where was the 6th Panzer Army? SHAEF intelligence assessed it was being held in reserve for defensive operations. Perhaps it would counterattack if the Allies broke through somewhere. But Koch wasn't convinced. He studied the pattern of German movements. Units were concentrating behind the Ardennes sector. Not just infantry divisions, but panzer divisions. Not just defensive preparations, but offensive positioning. Koch prepared a special intelligence estimate for Patton on December 9th. His assessment was alarming. The Germans were massing forces for an attack. The most likely target was the Ardennes. The attack could come within days. This contradicted everything SHAEF was saying. Koch knew his assessment would be unpopular. He presented it to Patton anyway. Patton read Koch's estimate carefully. He asked questions. He studied the maps. He trusted his intelligence officer's judgment. Koch had been right before. He was probably right now. "This is what I've been smelling," Patton said. "The Krauts are up to something big." On December 12th, Patton convened his staff meeting. He announced his belief that a German offensive was imminent. He ordered planning to begin for rapid reorientation of 3rd Army forces. Whatever direction the attack came from, 3rd Army would be ready to respond. The planning was done quietly. Patton didn't advertise his concerns to SHAEF. He knew what response he would get. Dismissed. Ridiculed. Told to focus on his own offensive operations instead of imagining phantom German attacks. So Patton prepared in silence. He had his staff develop 3 contingency plans. He identified which divisions could move fastest. He calculated road networks and fuel requirements. He rehearsed the orders that would be needed to shift an entire army in a new direction. When the attack came, Patton would be ready. The question was whether anyone would listen. The German plan. Adolf Hitler conceived Operation Wacht am Rhein in September 1944. His generals thought he was insane. Hitler didn't care. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. German forces would attack through the Ardennes, split the American and British armies, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. This would cut Allied supply lines and force a negotiated peace. The war in the West would be won in a single stroke. Hitler's generals presented him with logistical realities. Germany lacked sufficient fuel for the operation. The Luftwaffe couldn't provide adequate air cover. The divisions earmarked for the attack were understrength and undertrained. Hitler overruled every objection. He stripped forces from other sectors. He hoarded fuel for months. He gathered every available tank, artillery piece, and soldier. The attack would proceed regardless of what his generals thought. By December, the Germans had assembled 250,000 troops in 3 armies. The 6th Panzer Army under SS General Joseph Dietrich. The 5th Panzer Army under General Otto von Manschufel. The 7th Army under General Erich Brandenburger. Together they represented the last strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht. Security was absolute. German units moved only at night. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Officers were forbidden to discuss the operation even among themselves. Cover stories were circulated suggesting the forces were defensive reserves. The deception worked. Allied intelligence detected increased activity but couldn't determine its purpose. SHAEF continued to assess that major German offensive operations were impossible. Only Oscar Koch saw the truth, and only George Patton believed him. The attack was scheduled for December 16, 1944. Hitler called it his last gamble. If it succeeded, Germany might survive. If it failed, nothing else mattered. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the darkness exploded. German artillery opened fire across an 80-mile front. Over 1,900 guns poured shells into American positions. The ground shook. Trees shattered. Bunkers collapsed. Communications lines were cut. Then the Germans attacked. 3 armies rolled forward through the snow and fog. German soldiers wore white camouflage. German tanks emerged from the forest like ghosts. The assault hit the weakest point in the Allied line with overwhelming force. The American divisions in the Ardennes were caught completely by surprise. The 106th Infantry Division, in combat for less than a week, faced the full weight of the German assault. 2 of its 3 regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender. Over 7,000 Americans became prisoners in the first 2 days. Other units fought desperately. The 99th Infantry Division held its positions against repeated attacks, buying time for reserves to arrive. The 28th Infantry Division, already battered from previous fighting, conducted a fighting withdrawal that slowed the German advance. But the line was breaking. German panzer columns pushed west through gaps in American defenses. Panic spread. Rumors of German paratroopers and saboteurs behind the lines added to the confusion. At SHAEF headquarters, the first reports were dismissed as a local counterattack. Strong's intelligence section maintained that the Germans lacked the capability for a major offensive. This must be a spoiling attack, designed to disrupt Allied operations. By midday, the scope of the disaster became clear. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was a full-scale offensive involving multiple armies. The Germans were attacking with strength that Allied intelligence had said didn't exist. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting. The situation was critical. German forces were advancing rapidly. American units were scattered and confused. The entire Allied position in the Ardennes was in danger of collapse. Meanwhile, in Nancy, George Patton was already moving. Patton's preparation. When reports of the German attack reached 3rd Army headquarters, Patton's staff was ready. The contingency planning done on December 12 now proved its worth. Patton immediately understood the scope of the German operation. This wasn't a probe. This was Hitler's last gamble. And it was aimed at splitting the Allied armies and reaching Antwerp. But Patton also understood the opportunity. The Germans were concentrating their remaining strength in one place. If that strength could be destroyed, the war would be over. The Ardennes wasn't just a crisis. It was a chance to end the war in a single decisive battle. Patton called his staff together. He told them to implement contingency plan number 1, a 90-degree pivot to the north. 3rd Army would disengage from its current operations, wheel left, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. This was militarily insane by conventional standards. Armies don't pivot 90 degrees in the middle of winter while engaged with the enemy. The logistical requirements alone were staggering. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all had to be redirected to support operations in a completely different direction. Roads would be clogged. Communications would be disrupted. Units would lose contact with their supply lines. The attack would have to begin before preparations were complete. Patton didn't care. Speed was everything. The Germans were advancing. Every hour of delay meant more ground lost, more Americans killed or captured, more time for the enemy to consolidate gains. He ordered the 4th Armored Division to prepare for immediate movement. He instructed his corps commanders to begin disengagement from current operations. He sent staff officers racing ahead to reconnoiter routes and establish supply points. The 3rd Army began to turn. The Verdun Conference. December 19, 1944. The Caserne Maginot in Verdun, France. Eisenhower convened a meeting of senior commanders to address the crisis. The atmosphere was grim. German forces had penetrated 50 miles into Allied lines. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, was about to be surrounded. American casualties were mounting. The situation was the worst since Normandy. Eisenhower opened the meeting by declaring that the situation should be viewed as an opportunity, not a disaster. The Germans had come out of their defensive positions. They could be destroyed in the open. But how? The question hung in the cold air of the conference room. Eisenhower turned to Patton. When could Third Army attack north to relieve pressure on the Ardennes? Patton's answer stunned the room. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other commanders stared. Several laughed. They thought Patton was being his usual bombastic self, making promises he couldn't keep. Eisenhower didn't laugh. He knew Patton. He asked if Patton understood what he was saying. Moving 3 divisions 100 miles in winter, over icy roads, to attack a fortified enemy position, all within 48 hours? Patton said he understood completely. His staff had been planning this movement for a week. The orders were already prepared. The units were already aligning. All he needed was Eisenhower's authorization. The room fell silent. Patton wasn't bluffing. He had anticipated this moment. He had prepared for it while everyone else was assuring themselves that Germany couldn't attack. Eisenhower authorized the attack. Patton excused himself from the meeting and went to a telephone. He called his chief of staff, Bulge. Play ball, Patton said. Those 2 words set Third Army in motion. The great wheel to the north had begun. What Third Army accomplished in the next 48 hours remains one of the most remarkable military achievements in history. 3 divisions totaling over 100,000 men disengaged from combat, turned 90 degrees, and marched north through ice and snow to attack the German flank. They did this while maintaining combat effectiveness, without losing unit cohesion, and without running out of fuel or ammunition. The logistics were staggering. Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons of fuel per day. Every drop had to be transported by truck over roads that were icing over. Ammunition had to be pre-positioned at new dumps. Medical evacuation routes had to be established. Communication lines had to be restrung. Patton's staff had prepared for this. Supply officers had already identified stockpiles along the northern routes. Transportation units had been alerted. Signal companies had planned new communication networks. The 4th Armored Division led the advance. It was commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, one of Patton's most trusted officers. The division had been in continuous combat since Normandy. Its tanks were worn. Its crews were exhausted. But they moved. Behind the armor came the infantry. The 26th Infantry Division and the 80th Infantry Division marched through the night, their breath freezing in the air. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were loaded onto trucks. Others took their places and kept walking. The roads were chaos. Convoys stretched for miles. Traffic jams formed at every intersection. Military police worked around the clock to keep vehicles moving. When trucks broke down, they were pushed off the road and abandoned. Through it all, Patton drove his men relentlessly. He appeared at forward positions in his famous Jeep, wearing his polished helmet and ivory-handled revolvers. He encouraged, threatened, and inspired. He told his soldiers they were making history. They believed him. Bastogne. While Third Army wheeled north, Bastogne was dying. The town sat at the junction of 7 major roads. Whoever held Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. German commanders knew this. They surrounded the town and demanded surrender. The 101st Airborne Division held Bastogne with elements of other units that had been swept up in the retreat. They were outnumbered. They were running low on ammunition. They were freezing. German commanders sent a delegation under white flag on December 22nd. They demanded the American garrison surrender to avoid total annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the defense. He read the German demand. His response became legendary. Nuts. The German officers were confused. They asked for clarification. McAuliffe's aide explained, it meant, go to hell. The siege continued. German artillery pounded the town. German infantry probed the perimeter. The defenders held, but they couldn't hold forever. Without relief, Bastogne would fall. Patton knew this. He pushed his divisions harder. He demanded more speed. He personally threatened to relieve commanders who couldn't keep up the pace. The weather broke on December 23rd. Clear skies allowed Allied aircraft to finally fly. Transport planes dropped supplies to the Bastogne garrison. Fighter bombers savaged German columns on the open roads. The Luftwaffe, as predicted, was too weak to provide cover. But air support wasn't enough. Ground forces had to break through. The 4th Armored Division was still 20 miles from Bastogne, fighting through German defensive positions in every village. Patton raged. He called forward commanders and demanded progress. He told them the 101st was depending on them. He told them the eyes of the world were watching. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded a tank battalion in the 4th Armored Division. He would later become Army Chief of Staff and have a tank named after him. On December 26, 1944, he was trying to break through to Bastogne. His battalion was the spearhead. They had been fighting for 3 days straight. Men were sleeping in their tanks between firefights. Ammunition was running low. But they were close. Abrams led his tanks toward the village of Eisenhower, the last obstacle before Bastogne. German defenders had fortified the town. Anti-tank guns covered the approaches. Abrams didn't wait for infantry support. He didn't wait for artillery preparation. He ordered his tanks to charge straight through the village at maximum speed, guns blazing. The attack was reckless by any standard. Tank commanders stood in their hatches firing machine guns while drivers pushed through the streets. German soldiers scattered. Anti-tank guns were overrun before they could fire. Abrams' tanks burst out of Eisenhower and drove straight into the Bastogne perimeter. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26, 1944, the siege was broken. Patton arrived at Bastogne the next day. He met with McAuliffe and toured the defensive positions. He praised the paratroopers for their stand. He posed for photographs with his victorious soldiers. The relief of Bastogne made headlines around the world. Third Army had done the impossible. They had pivoted 90 degrees, marched 100 miles in winter, and broken through German lines in less than 5 days. SHAEF intelligence had said Germany couldn't launch a major offensive. Patton's intelligence officer had predicted it 10 days in advance. The man who was dismissed had been vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. The Battle of the Bulge continued into January 1945. German forces made no further significant advances after December 26. By mid-January, Allied forces had eliminated the Bulge and restored the original front line. German losses were catastrophic. Over 100,000 casualties. 800 tanks destroyed. Irreplaceable reserves of fuel and ammunition expended. The Wehrmacht's last offensive capability was shattered. Allied losses were also severe. Over 80,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed. The Ardennes was the bloodiest battle of the Western Front. But the strategic outcome was clear. Hitler's gamble had failed. Germany had nothing left for another offensive. The road to Berlin was open. In the aftermath, questions were asked. How had German preparations escaped Allied intelligence? Why had warnings been ignored? Why was the Ardennes left so weakly defended? The answers were uncomfortable. Allied intelligence had been overconfident. SHAEF had underestimated German capabilities and willpower. Warnings from officers like Oscar Koch had been dismissed because they contradicted official assessments. Colonel Koch was vindicated but not celebrated. Intelligence officers rarely received public recognition. His contribution to Third Army's rapid response remained largely unknown to the public. Patton received the glory. His relief of Bastogne became the defining moment of his military career. The 90-degree pivot demonstrated everything he had preached about mobile warfare: speed, aggression, and bold action. Eisenhower acknowledged that Patton's preparation had been crucial. Without the contingency planning done before December 16th, Third Army could not have moved so quickly. Patton's paranoia had proven to be prescient. The intelligence failure. The Battle of the Bulge prompted a thorough review of Allied intelligence failures. The conclusions were damning. SHAEF intelligence had focused on what Germany couldn't do rather than what Germany might attempt. Analysts calculated German fuel shortages, manpower deficits, and production limitations. They concluded that offensive operations were impossible. They forgot that Hitler didn't care about what was possible. He cared about what was necessary. If Germany was going to lose anyway, a desperate gamble made sense. Rational analysis didn't apply to irrational actors. German operational security had been exceptional. Units moved at night. Radio silence was maintained. Cover stories were circulated. But there were still indicators that something was building. Koch had identified those indicators. Disappearing panzer divisions. Increased rail traffic. Unusual German radio discipline. He connected the dots while SHAEF dismissed them as noise. The lesson was clear. Intelligence analysis must consider enemy intentions, not just enemy capabilities. An enemy in desperate circumstances may attempt operations that seem impossible on paper. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly in subsequent decades. Pearl Harbor, the Tet Offensive, the Yom Kippur War. Intelligence agencies consistently underestimated what enemies might attempt because they focused on rational calculations rather than desperate gambles. Oscar Koch's report of December 9, 1944, should have changed everything. It didn't. SHAEF dismissed it. Only Patton listened. The men who saw. Oscar Koch continued serving as Patton's intelligence officer until the end of the war. He received the Legion of Merit for his service but never gained wide public recognition. After the war, Koch wrote about his experience in various military journals. He emphasized the importance of considering enemy intentions alongside enemy capabilities. He argued that intelligence officers should be willing to present unpopular assessments if the evidence supported them. His warnings about the Ardennes became a case study in military intelligence education. The Army War College used his December 9th estimate as an example of how good intelligence should work. Students learned that correct analysis is worthless if commanders ignore it. Koch retired from the Army as a brigadier general. He died in 1970, still largely unknown outside military circles. The man who predicted the Bulge never wrote a best-selling memoir. He never became famous. He simply did his job correctly when it mattered most. Patton, of course, achieved immortality. The relief of Bastogne cemented his reputation as America's greatest combat commander. His ability to anticipate the German attack and prepare accordingly demonstrated that he was more than just an aggressive leader. He was a thinking general who trusted good intelligence and planned for contingencies. Patton died in December 1945, exactly 1 year after the Bulge, from injuries sustained in a car accident. He never got to write the full story of his preparation for the German offensive. His diaries and letters contained fragments, but the complete picture remained scattered. Only after his death did historians piece together what had happened in the days before December 16th. The staff meetings, the contingency planning, the quiet preparation while SHAEF assured everyone that Germany couldn't attack. Leadership lessons. The Battle of the Bulge offers enduring lessons about leadership and preparation. First, trust your experts. Patton didn't understand intelligence analysis the way Koch did, but he recognized Koch's competence and trusted his judgment. When Koch said something was wrong, Patton listened. Leaders who ignore their experts because the news is unwelcome invite disaster. Second, prepare for what might happen, not just what should happen. SHAEF planned based on their assessment of German capabilities. Patton planned based on what the Germans might attempt. One approach was rational. The other was prudent. Third, speed requires preparation. Third Army's 90-degree pivot looked miraculous, but it wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of careful planning done days in advance. The contingency plans, the supply positioning, the route reconnaissance, all of this enabled the rapid response that saved Bastogne. Fourth, contrarian voices have value. Koch's assessment contradicted the official SHAEF position. In many organizations, such contradictions are suppressed or ignored. Patton created space for dissenting views. He wanted to hear what might go wrong, not just what should go right. Fifth, action validates analysis. Koch's warning would have been meaningless if Patton hadn't acted on it. Good intelligence is worthless without commanders willing to use it. The partnership between Koch and Patton demonstrated how intelligence and operations should work together. The letter that wasn't written. Unlike Eisenhower, Patton didn't write a failure letter before the Bulge. He didn't need to. He was already prepared. But Eisenhower should have been paying attention to what Patton's preparation revealed. The Supreme Commander had dismissed warnings about German offensive capability. When those warnings proved accurate, Eisenhower relied on Patton to save the situation. In his memoirs, Eisenhower acknowledged that Third Army's rapid response had been crucial. He praised Patton's leadership during the crisis. But he never fully addressed why SHAEF intelligence had failed so completely. The closest Eisenhower came to accepting responsibility was a brief acknowledgement that we were taken by surprise. This was true but incomplete. They were taken by surprise because they dismissed warnings that the surprise was coming. Oscar Koch's December 9th estimate sat in Third Army files, waiting for historians to discover it. When they did, they found a document that should have prevented the surprise. Koch had identified the threat. He had predicted the target. He had assessed the timing within days of accuracy. The intelligence existed. The warning was given. The response was dismissal. Patton's vindication at the Bulge wasn't just about his tactical brilliance. It was about his willingness to listen when others wouldn't. He took seriously what SHAEF took for granted. He prepared for danger while others celebrated approaching victory. Echoes through history. The lessons of the Ardennes were not fully learned. Intelligence failures continued to plague military operations for decades. In 1950, American forces in Korea ignored warnings that Chinese forces were massing across the Yalu River. General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence chief dismissed reports of Chinese involvement. When 300,000 Chinese soldiers attacked, American forces were caught by surprise. In 1973, Israeli intelligence dismissed warnings that Egypt was preparing to attack across the Suez Canal. The Yom Kippur War began with a devastating surprise that nearly destroyed Israel. In 2001, American intelligence agencies failed to connect dots indicating that Al-Qaeda was planning a major attack on American soil. The 9/11 Commission report documented numerous warnings that were ignored or minimized. Each failure echoed the Ardennes. Intelligence officers saw the signs. Commanders dismissed them. The official assessment said the threat was minimal. Reality proved otherwise. Oscar Koch's ghost haunts every intelligence failure. Somewhere, in every case, an analyst saw what was coming. Somewhere, a warning was given. Somewhere, leadership chose comfort over truth. The man who listened. December 1944. The snow fell on the Ardennes. German forces were massing. Allied intelligence was blind. But in Nancy, France, a 3-star general sat with his intelligence officer, studying maps and asking questions. He didn't dismiss the warnings. He didn't demand comfortable assessments. He listened. Georges Patton Jr. was many things. Arrogant, profane, controversial, brilliant. But above all, he was prepared. When he told Eisenhower he could attack in 48 hours, he wasn't boasting. He was stating a fact. His staff had done the work. His divisions were ready. His supply lines were positioned. All that remained was the order. 10 days before the German attack, Patton predicted it would come. He was dismissed by higher headquarters. He was contradicted by official intelligence. He was told the Germans couldn't attack. He prepared anyway. The relief of Bastogne saved the Allied position in the Ardennes. It prevented a disaster that could have prolonged the war by months. It demonstrated what American forces could accomplish under bold leadership. But the real lesson of the Bulge isn't about tanks and tactics. It's about listening. It's about trusting experts who bring unwelcome news. It's about preparing for danger instead of hoping it won't come. Oscar Koch saw the German attack coming. He documented his assessment. He presented it to his commander. He was right. George Patton listened. He believed his intelligence officer. He prepared his army. He was ready. SHAEF dismissed the warnings. They trusted their assumptions. They were wrong. The difference between preparation and catastrophe was one general who listened when others wouldn't. One intelligence officer who saw what others missed. One staff that planned for contingencies instead of certainties. The snow stopped falling on December 26th. The skies cleared over Bastogne. American tanks broke through the German lines. And somewhere in the chaos, Oscar Koch watched his prediction come true. The man who had been dismissed had been vindicated. The warning that was ignored had proven accurate. The Battle of the Bulge was won by many factors. Allied air power, German fuel shortages, the heroism of soldiers at Bastogne, and 100 other unnamed positions. But it was also won by a colonel who studied maps in a French headquarters, who saw patterns others missed, who told his commander what no one wanted to hear. And it was won by a general who listened. That is the lesson of December 1944. Not that Patton was brilliant, though he was. Not that Third Army was unstoppable, though it seemed so. But that leadership requires listening. That preparation requires humility. That victory requires hearing warnings before they become disasters. Oscar Koch gave the warning. George Patton heeded it. Together, they saved an army. SHAEF dismissed them both. History proved them right. The Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied victory. But it should never have been such a close call. The warnings were there. The intelligence existed. The prediction was made. All that was missing was someone willing to listen. In Nancy, they listened. In Versailles, they didn't. And that difference of listening, that willingness to hear unwelcome truth, made all the difference in the world.